Welcome everybody. Tonight we're going to continue our discussion of Nietzsche and specifically his work on the birth of tragedy. Just want to remind you that last time we read first 13 sections or chapters within that work of his, and we stopped at that point right about the time when he started talking about Socrates and the influence of Socrates on tragedy and how that was a kind of a pivotal point in the development of Greek tragedy. Before we delve in, I just want to jog our memory real quick and maybe point out a couple of memorable passages that I think sum up some of the more eloquent points that Nietzsche makes along the way. I think one of the pleasures for me of reading this is every now and then you encounter these gems, and of course Nietzsche is a master of putting these together in a very eloquent and inimitable way. Really, nobody can quite compare to him in this regard. So one of the things that he starts out with is to say that the existence of the world is justified only as an aesthetic experience. That in itself is probably something we can talk about for 2 hours. But the point he's trying to make is that existence as is, with all of its tragic ups and downs and chaotic sort of topsy-turviness and just the inability to cope with it, or the difficulty of coping with it is what makes art an aesthetic experience so important. And that point he really develops in his treatment of tragedy. So his main thesis in part 1 is that tragedy arises out of this tragic viewpoint, tragic experience of the world. And when I say tragic, we're not talking about being depressed or being morose or anything like that. It's just the idea that we experience the world as is, and we let every part of the world influence us, affect us, not just some selected parts of it, not just the beautiful parts, but the ugly, the cruel, the chaotic, the unjust, the irrational. Every part of that, in Nietzsche's view, has some value. Existence in itself has value, and that's the big point that he's making. But the way we mediate that is through art. And art is, in his mind, the highest calling of man. Another gem that he has is art is not a diversion from life. It is life in its proper sense. That's his direct quote from him. So in his mind, art is the kind of the chief end of man. And by art, the highest expression of art in Greek culture was tragedy in his mind. So tragedy, the word itself, tragodia, literally means goat song. It comes out of the celebrations devoted to Dionysus. And so he takes that as another starting point for making his second focal point, which is that art lives at the intersection of two opposing forces, the Dionysian and the Apollonian. The Dionysian is the force of chaos, the force of irrationality, the force that is exemplified by being drunk, not being able to control oneself. Whereas the Apollonian is the part of nature and part of our human experience, which is more controlled, more rational, more subdued, more under our control in some way. So the way it expresses itself, tragedy is the Dionysian, more of an expression of a Dionysian experience. And then Nietzsche also makes a distinction to say that we have something called he calls plastic arts, which are sculpture, painting, and so on. And these are more Apollonian in per se, because they're more, I guess, thought out, they're more planned, they're executed with some sort of foreknowledge of what you're trying to achieve. Whereas The tragedy, the music is more spontaneous. And he ties tragedy and music very tightly, following the tradition that I think goes back to Aristotle, to say that initially tragedies were just these songs that were sung in the procession of Dionysus, and then that song or the chorus really developed into some sort of plot, some sort of action, and that's how we have tragedy now. So that's how it developed. And I think pretty much everybody is on the same page there, you know, based on the etymology of the word, and also just our understanding and the extant tragedies that we have. We can see that initially chorus played a huge part in tragedies, in the earlier tragedies, and then eventually the chorus kind of fades, becomes more secondary, and becomes more of an addendum or parallel to the play, not really integral to it. And that's Nietzsche's third departure point for saying, well, why did this happen, and is this a good thing, and what's actually going on here? And so he traces this to Socratic influence. And Socrates in his mind, and everything associated with Socrates, is what led to this diminishing role of the chorus. And in his mind, according to his own argument, it led to a decrease in the quality of this art form. So what is he talking about? Well, he's talking about this idea that in order to have an aesthetic experience, you have to have your intellect engaged fully. In order to have the aesthetic experience, you have to understand what it is that you're experiencing. Maybe as an example, if, let's say, according to that viewpoint, you cannot really enjoy music unless you understand musical theory, or you cannot really understand a play or a tragedy unless you are a master in philology or something like that. Or at least you have an understanding of what it is you're portraying, more so than the understanding of the forms, but the understanding of the essence of what it is you're portraying. So if you are portraying some event, you have to explain why this event occurred, what led up to it, everything following it, everything that was involved. In other words, you have to almost have this sort of rational underpinning for it before you can properly enjoy it. And this idea was kind of ties together very well with Socrates' dictum that we all know: unexamined life is not worth living. And then you know, his idea that the only sin is ignorance, and virtue is knowledge, right? He kind of makes a point in saying that the reason people do not behave the way they ought to is because they're ignorant. And if we can only shine the light, that example of the cave, people sitting in a cave and not really realizing what's happening. If we can only lead people out of the cave, and if we can only shine the light of understanding into their hearts and minds, bam, everything will all of a sudden be fixed, and they will live a righteous and fulfilling life. So that's the Socratic program. And in fact, it is a program that has been carried out in our history, European tradition. Enlightenment is the epitome of this thinking. It's still with us. We still place a huge premium on intellect and knowledge and everything around that. So that definitely, that thinking is still with us to a large degree. The opposite of that is this thinking that no, the way we experience with the world in its highest form is through unmediated experience of it. We don't need to analyze it to experience it. In fact, if we analyze it, then we're losing something. We're not gaining, we're losing. That's I guess I would say in Western tradition, this would correspond to the Romantic period, the Romanticism in literature and in painting and so on. So we have these two opposing schools of thought that Nietzsche really develops, and he goes through and kind of discusses the details of the Socratic method and how it dovetails with his argument. What I find really fascinating, though, is towards the end of this discussion, he relates a story that we're told in one of Plato's dialogues in Phaedo, where Plato is, imprisoned. He's awaiting his, he's waiting to be executed or to drink his hemlock. And, friends visit him, and he tells them that he's been having these dreams. And in the dreams, something comes to him, and it says, Socrates, you have to cultivate and practice music. And this has happened to him even before, but he was never paying attention to it. And when he relates the story to his friends, he says, well, I've always assumed that philosophy is, in fact, the highest form of art and music. And that kind of sums up his whole viewpoint on how, rationality and intellect is really the highest expression of man's nature, man's potential. But in prison, awaiting his, basically living out the rest of his days there, a few days that he has left, he is realizing that maybe he didn't have a correct understanding of this injunction, wherever it came from, some god or some demon that was haunting him, and he decides to actually start practicing it. So he puts some fable of Aesop's to music, and to his friends' amazement, right? Because they've never observed him doing anything like this. And Nietzsche relates all of this to say that he thinks that this sort of mirrors perhaps the trajectory of Western development, where we start out with this pure art form, tragedy in its purest form, and then it gets corrupted by these intellectual trends, right? But afterwards, there is a swing back, and in that swing, he calls it music. He describing Socrates, he says Socrates becomes a music practicing Socrates, and this expression, music practicing Socrates, is his picture of Western world that returns to kind of the original experience of art, and the experience of art that grows out of music, specifically kind of the Dionysian music that is all about expression of what is, right, of what we see in the world, the kind of unmediated by as much as possible by anything else, not really planned out like you would plan a sculpture or a painting or something like that. So that's kind of a quick overview of some of the main movements in the second part. Now, I'm curious if any of you want to zoom in on any specific point. There's a lot here that we can go into, but I don't want to talk for like 2 hours, so I'd rather have a discussion. So if anybody wants to share what they thought was pivotal and critical to the understanding of this section, go ahead and type an exclamation point in the chat, and then we can take it from there. And while people are thinking and collecting their thoughts, I do want to mention one maybe a somewhat humorous connection to this text, which came to me maybe surprisingly to some of you, as I was reading Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He has a book called Anti-Fragile, in which he has a fictional character, Fat Tony. Fat Tony is a mafia boss, and in his book, he has this fictitious dialogue between Fat Tony and Socrates. And the point of that dialogue is that they're arguing about whether or not you need to have a deep understanding of the world in order to be an ethical, good person, or have, live a kind of a flourishing life. And this really, again, this comes back to this discussion very pointedly, because we're talking about the same thing, whether or not human beings experience life and art and everything else primarily through our minds, or is there something deeper, more basic at the core of it all that really we've stopped listening to, and we are therefore we're losing parts of ourselves. We're gaining in our intellectual prowess, but we're losing in perhaps in the quality, in the expression, in the poetic quality of our lives. So yeah, so David, go ahead. Go ahead. Can you unmute yourself?
You'll have to unmute. Go ahead, David.
Okay. My preferred explanation of what we're discussing, the difference between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, is that in terms of our perceptions of reality, now every perception that we have has got an affective coloration, an emotional coloration. And it's argued by some that you can't have a perception unless it's also got a that affective emotional coloration to it. Perhaps a more sophisticated way of looking at that would be that every perception has got a cognizant element and as well as an affective emotional element. So you've got both. You see, they're there as part of our human consciousness. So what's further argued, and of course this is all, philosophical speculation, so it's just, a theory. So that those cognizant elements can be organized, and they become, ultimately, perhaps science is the best example of their organization, and the affective elements can also be. We also organize our affective elements, and that becomes the aesthetic realm, on which art is perhaps that extreme viewpoint. So you've got the two. At the extreme, science and art are the two extremes. Now, but you see, you can divide each side up into different elements, and they've both got more or less of each other's elements within them. So in other words, if we look at social science, well, that's got far more affective, human interest, etc., within them. So you can actually form a scale of which has got, they argue that perhaps physics has got, the most cognizant and least affective elements within it. And then when you look at art, you've got the same thing. So it's argued that music is the extreme. Some people argue it's purely emotional, it's purely affective. But then, as you said, as you were mentioning, Philip, in sculpture and other forms of representational art, you get more and more cognizant elements within them. And when it comes to on that art side, the novels, well, novels cannot be anything else but a mixture of both. And how much mixture? How much? How much it's got to be historical or refer to reality, as opposed to just the emotion. Actually, what I've just said is no, I don't quite like calling, because reality involves both. But so at the same time, psychology as a science, is highly involved with the emotions and the affects. So it's interesting. Anyway, that's just a way the two are divided up by some people. But at the same time, it's almost like, except for the extremes, they're all a mixture of both the cognizant and the affective. So in other words, we're almost, anyway, that's enough from me.
No, thank you, David. That was very good. And you made a couple of points I want to touch upon. So as far as science goes, so this is very interesting, right? In the first part, in fact, in the very beginning of the first part, Nietzsche starts out by saying that we typically look at a civilization that's optimistic in its outlook as a healthy civilization. But he argues that actually it's the opposite. A civilization that's pessimistic is more healthy in his mind. And what does he mean by that? Well, we have a sort of optimism that in our outlook, and this optimism is the optimism of a person who says, I may not know everything, but I'm confident of my and our collective ability to essentially embrace this world and understand it fully. Not today, not tomorrow, but at some point. In other words, we have this optimism that we can rationalize, rationalize is not the right word. We can kind of envelop reality in this intellectual web that we weave. And this web will tell us pretty much how the world is, and more importantly, will tell us how to control it, right? So there's this optimism about that. I mean, it's progress, right? That's the name for this optimism. It's called progress. The idea that we're getting better, we're moving upwards. Now, the pessimistic viewpoint says, no. No, what we're doing when we engage with science and technology and so on is we are mistaking the means for the ends. The ends are not improving. We're just improving the means that we have. In other words, we might improve our physical and the longevity of our lives, but we're not really necessarily improving the quality of our lives as compared to somebody who lived 200 years ago. Maybe we are, maybe we aren't. I mean, that's an argument. I'm not saying I agree with it necessarily, but that's the argument he's making, is that pessimism is a viewpoint that says, no, life in general is tragic. And there's nothing else. I mean, and a person who understands it has then an opportunity, this tragic force that's kind of compressing us can find an outlet in art. Art is the way we kind of save ourselves, how we heal ourselves, and it's really the only way out of this terrible conundrum that we find ourselves in called life, existence, right? The only other way is insanity or depression and death. And so an optimistic society in Nietzsche's viewpoint, and he comes back to this in part two, and he says at some point what will happen is the high priests of this cult of science will find that they've reached their limits and they can do no more. And at that point, the pendulum will swing back, and we'll realize that in fact what we've needed all along is not to try to necessarily fight, to try to envelop the world in our minds, with our minds, but we need to embrace every aspect of the world and somehow transform it into beauty and art. And that's where, in his mind, that's how tragedies are born. And of course, the full name of the work is The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. And music is this Dionysian form of art and form of existence, and in fact, a mirror of existence in Nietzsche's mind that develops eventually into spoken forms of art, such as tragedy. So there's a lot there that I've touched on. Again, I'm just curious if anyone else wants to add anything to it. Maritza, go ahead.
Thanks, Philip. So I would say I love the way he points out at the very beginning of the second part that we read, where he does that, where he shows, he tells us what he believes to be the fundamental secret of science, and then he kind of debunks it. And he said, but he brings up in his debunking, he doesn't start with using the word art. He uses myth. And he says, when reasoning cannot succeed in this endeavor, myth must also finally serve. And he says, it's a necessary consequence. Indeed, it's even the purpose of science. I would, and myth comes up throughout all the following chapters through to, like, 25, and I'm interested in the manner in which he uses the word myth, because he goes on to say, so I'm looking for a corollary, and I didn't see it, so I would love to hear if I just missed it and you can help me out. Because he says also in the early on, I think chapter 15, he says, art is the remedy for pessimism, which that goes perfectly. There's no contradiction there. This is what we knew he was getting there already by the first several chapters. But then he goes on and he says that he talks about how from the essence of art, it is generally impossible to derive the tragic. And he says, only with reference to the spirit of music do we understand the joy and the destruction of the individual. And then, he gives he gives examples, and he says, and he makes clear to us the external, phenomenon of Dionysian art, which brings into expression the will. But the question here is, where is the so he says music is capable of generating myth, and that that's like one of them, and that's where you get the the birth in particular to the tragic myth, he's saying. So where does he tie there the concept of so is he using art and myth interchangeably? That's what I wasn't sure about.
Right. No, that's a good point. No, I don't think he uses it interchangeably.
I don't think
Mhm.
so either, but sometimes I wonder.
He does say at one point that, and I'm trying to find in my notes the place where, but he does say at one point that music is in fact music engenders, gives birth to myth.
Yes, and it's in the same section that's in chapter
and so
16. He literally says that.
It seems to me that there is a kind of an evolution, a progression of what's happening. First, music is the kind of universal language, right? He talks about that, music being the universal language, not just of a particular person or culture, but it's almost like a mirror of reality. Yes. So it's a very deep underlying thing. And the next step in that development, once we become aware of it, or we are able to imitate it and so on, the next thing that happens, it awakens in us two things. One is the symbolism of this Dionysian something, right? A Dionysian symbol. But the second part is the myth. And the myth, of course, is the storytelling, right? So the stories, these feelings that we have, they coalesce into these sort of symbolic, archetypal stories that become the substance of the tragedies. And with that, he makes an interesting point. He says, when you read the tragedies, the things that the protagonists say are not as deep as what's actually happening. The action itself is much deeper than anything they can say. So it's not about analyzing, like, and deconstructing their dialogues. It's really about understanding and observing what's happening. And I mean, that is so true. When you think of a story like Oedipus, right? How many of us can quote, lines from Oedipus? I don't think anybody can, but we all know the story. The story resonates because it has an amazing potential and power by itself. You don't need to know the exact, line that Oedipus says to whoever, right? Tiresias. You just know the story, and the story itself has this amazing impact on us. And it's the same for all the great plays, all the great tragedies. The story itself has that impetus, right? And that's a point that Nietzsche makes in connection with this Dionysian slant in art versus these other influences that he considers to be degenerative, that come in later And Euripides is, in his mind, the person that kind of starts that trend with kind of thinking it through and trying to analyze everything and make it, he's trying to maximize the effect on the audience. And so he is now developing everything, and the chorus becomes kind of like a prologue, right? Because why does the chorus become a prologue? Well, because if you think about Socratic methodology, you have to explain everything, right? You can't just leave things unexplained. You have to explain how we got here, what's happening. You have to also give some kind of summary in the end, right? So it's this sort of logical syllogism, right? Instead of a tragedy, it's all kind of neatly packaged now. And in Nietzsche's mind, it starts to lose this intrinsic power. He then takes it further, and he compares this to the development of Italian opera, which I have to say I'm a little bit on the fence there because I love opera. But I do have to say he does have some points there. So basically, opera in some ways is an artificial invention. And it's an artificial in the sense that what you're doing is you are fitting the words and the dialogues with music, and you, by necessity, you have to make it somewhat stylistic, right? You can't just let people talk as they feel, or like things just cannot happen haphazardly. And so, but with that, you lose some of the immediacy of the original Greek plays, right? So it's an interesting point, an interesting argument. I think people can probably argue it both ways, but it's interesting that he makes it. I also wonder if a lot of it has to do with him being German. And, there's always some rift between the Northern Europe and the Southern Europe, and the Germans, they just don't like all those emotional Southern Europeans, Italians, and French. So there's always some kind of, we're the austere, pure German philosophers versus these degenerate Italian operettas. So anyway, it's an interesting argument, though, and it kind of highlights his thrust.
Okay, so thank you for catching me up with this. So Phil, I mean, this is just gold. There are so many points here which are so deep. I mean, I want to just list, the ones that you made in the beginning. Saying that aesthetic experience gives meaning to life itself, or that art is the highest calling. That art is life. So this set of things, right? Now that is so deep. That's a view of art, which is so exalted, right? So that's one point I want to talk about. The second point, I always, I'm very, very suspicious of Plato, because whenever he uses Socrates, I think he's just smuggling in. Half the time he's smuggling in his own stuff. So I'll just call it Plato. So there is Plato whose approach to art is dramatically different from the ancient Greek approach to art. So for example, the way in which Greeks looked at the Iliad or the Odyssey or the great plays, and they are actually very close to how Nietzsche is thinking about it. It is like core part of life. And, of course, Plato wants to ban artists in his Republic, which is exactly opposite, right? You ask the question, again, I'm going to put it in Plato's mouth here. Is philosophy more fundamental, or is philosophy or music the highest expression? Music, I'll use short form for art. Okay, so basically this is really talking about the meaning of art itself. So let's step back and let me ask you the question. Talk a little bit about what Nietzsche's view of art is. Forget about his polemics against how things have changed. What does he think art can be and should be?
Right. Well, from my take on it is, just after reading all of this, is that he fundamentally views art, and obviously, he already said that, art is the true vocation of man. So it's not science, it's not discovering the universe. And again, this is Nietzsche's viewpoint. I want to make it clear. This is not
exactly. We are just talking about Nietzsche's viewpoint.
Nietzsche's viewpoint is that man's highest calling is fundamentally artistic, not intellectual. And in fact, he is very strong on this. He makes this point that the more you go to the other side of the brain and you use science and knowledge to try to encompass the world with those tools, you are losing instead of gaining. And the place where you're going with that is, the place of this optimism, which is again kind of upside down, right? We think of optimism as a good thing, but he thinks of it as a symptom of disease. In his mind, optimism is a symptom that you don't have.
Let me interrupt for a second.
Okay.
Before we go into detail, if you were to ask Nietzsche, what is art? What would he say?
Well, okay, so he probably would say that art is a way that man escapes tragedy of life. I mean, that's not definition of art, but it's a description of art, right? Mm-hmm. Art is the way we escape the tragedy of living. Life is tragic, and we have really very limited sets of ways we can escape it. One is suicide, depression, or insanity, right? But the other way is through taking that tragedy and transforming it internally and expressing it through either music or tragedy or myth, right? All of those are expressions of this conflict that we have. The conflict within us and in nature and in the world is the conflict between the Apollonian and the Dionysian forces, which are everywhere. They're in the natural world, they're inside of us, they are at work all the time. And the only way we can reconcile them is through expressing them in some form of art.
Wonderful. And what does he say? I mean, the other point about his polemic against Socrates or Plato is that they did something to art to destroy it. What did they do?
Right. So the idea was that initially there's this kind of unmediated progression of experience of the world. That experience excites something in us, and we just kind of express it, right? But Socratic way is not to do this, and in fact to stop us in our tracks and say, wait. We have to kind of become not the subject of this, but a person that's looking from the side and trying to examine everything. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you become an observant, a critic, right? As soon as we become an art critic instead of a person who experiences art, okay, we've lost, in his mind, we're on our way down. We're degrading the experience. And Euripides is the person that started this with his kind of rational approach to playmaking. So as opposed to just following the tradition, and what is tradition? Tradition is just an embodied expression of this drive, this motion, this movement. So instead of following that, Euripides tries to kind of organize it and make chorus serve particular purposes, right? In elucidating something and maybe foretelling something, and it kind of loses its power. The chorus becomes not a voice of Dionysus, if you will, but a voice of reason, right? It becomes a voice of reason that starts comparing things and helps us on our way in terms of interpreting. And that in some ways helps, right? But in some ways it also kind of degrades it. And then it goes a step further. And according to Socrates, if you you cannot enjoy something unless you understand it. That's the dictum. And if that's the approach, we have to understand everything before we can enjoy it. Well, that's a pretty high bar, number one. But secondly, it doesn't really jive with our experience, because we know we can experience things without understanding anything about them at all. So it contradicts our experience, right? But here is the part that I thought was brilliant. Socrates, at the end of his life, realizes this. And that's the Phaedo story, right? The story there is that while he's sitting in a cell, he has a dream that says, Socrates, you better cultivate and practice music. And so he starts doing this, and he can't explain it. It's not a rational thing, right? It's a dream. There's nothing rational about that. And he starts putting some Aesop's fables to music. And his friends are all surprised because he's never done anything like this. And so this becomes a picture of a person who has first kind of overextended himself in this intellectual capacity, but then comes back and recovers the initial spirit of music, if you will.
Wow. Wow. I mean, there's just so much to say about this, because one of the things that is there is that, like, if you look at time before Plato, I'm going to call it Plato because Socrates, I'm very, very skeptical. I like the Xenophon's Socrates to be closer. He's a very different person than Plato's Socrates. So I'm just going to call it Plato, because his ideas actually underlie all of this. Firstly, there is, before Plato, there is this integration between art and life. It's this part of life. This is part of action. So it is not, and the extent of you do contemplation is all in the process of your feeling, your acting, and your thinking is one loop.
Mm-hmm.
What happens with Plato is that he separates the world. He says there are intellectual disciplines which these philosophers can do, and there are these menial actions that are there in the world, and they kind of look down upon these. These are supposed to be done by slaves and not really important. And moment you kind of split the man into half, making one a ghost and the other the corpse, you take life out of man, and your art dies because man dies. And that's kind of, I'm putting it in a dramatic way, but that integration is very much there in Homer. And post Plato, at least the philosophers lose it. I think art still carries it, because art still is carrying the traditions, and how it is done is being carried. You can see it in sculpture, you can see it in music, to the extent to which they've been able to recreate it. But so it's a huge point. So thank you so much. I think we have Ella. Ella, go ahead.
Sure. Beginning with the Socrates, it reminds him what he said about he should have incorporated music. It's like the dialectic, he's going in opposition to what he actually has practiced his entire life. And it's like Carl Jung would say, it's like the shadow. The creative part has to come out. And so it comes out in Socrates' dream, that, other side of him that he wants to express. And, I totally agree with everything you're saying, that, I think that the emotion and everything everyone said, the emotion, the thoughts, the ideas, our history, our culture, collectively, our cultures collectively, all are sort of a part of all of us. And I think we can express ourselves in a formal play, writing literature, but we can also just be a great at gardening or fly fishing, or a beautiful flower garden. And I don't think you have to, it has to be totally intellectualized, because at that point you are cutting off parts of yourself. They're cut out of the picture. And so the idea is to be whole and to be genuine and let all of the parts express themselves. But I did want to say something about science. Just looking into quantum physics, I'll be brief. There's something really amazing about what they found recently beyond the traditional physics and the quantum physics. It's intellectual for sure. I'm not an expert, but there's just something amazing about it. And so yeah, there's that feeling of being at one with the universe, nature, when you think about it and study it. And I was thinking of David Bohm, who studied with Krishnamurti. Yeah,
Rikan, you're muted.
Ella, let's not go too far because I want to get back to Nietzsche. Okay, thanks. All right, Phil, please continue.
Right. So I want to I had a quote for you, but I wanted to say one more thing because we were on Plato. So in this passage, again, this is a very memorable thing that Plato says, or rather Socrates says. And he says that when this being told him in his sleep to practice music, well, he thought that he was practicing music all his life, because in his mind, philosophy is the most beautiful music. So that's a perfect expression of Apollonian sort of thinking about art, right? Philosophy is the perfect music. Well, okay, Socrates, obviously you've never listened to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or something like that, because then you'd know that it's not the perfect expression of music. But anyway, but it's interesting that he says that, and it's completely consistent with his outlook and with his philosophy. And Nietzsche takes that and he runs with it, and he says, you know, to a modern person, a non-theoretical man is absurd. You know, he makes these statements that are so memorable. A non-theoretical man is absurd. What does he mean by that? Well, a person that doesn't have a theory about everything is absurd. But of course, you know, do we all need to have a theory about everything in order to experience life, in order to enjoy, in order to appreciate, in order to be kind of part of this tragic existence that's part of playing it out? Probably not. So anyway, it's just another tidbit that I want to throw out there, possibly another point of discussion, that what is the place of theory and theoretical knowledge in all of this? Is it really completely a negative, right? That's the question, I guess, number one, because Nietzsche paints it pretty much as a negative. But the other part is on the plus side, right? We have this instinct and the Dionysian in us, and obviously that's not always positive either. And we're not always able to express it in some beautiful way. It's just, you know, tragic. So is being an optimist or being a pessimist overstated to a degree? And do we really need to be pessimists in order to be art creators, right? Because Nietzsche kind of says we do. We have to be. Otherwise, we don't have any fuel for our art. What fuels us is suffering, is tragedy, realizing it, looking at it, appreciating it, right? He even says that from his standpoint, annihilation is a beautiful thing, just as creation. It's all beautiful, right? It's all, you know, it's all good. Even the evil is good. I mean, that's his kind of stance, right? Beyond good and evil. I mean, you know, you can kind of already see the seeds of his later philosophy here, right? It's not about, there is no morality, it's just living, right? Life and will. I mean, it's dangerous. I mean, we know it's dangerous when you kind of espouse this and take it too far, because you can just say, you can justify anything, right? And he kind of does. He says life's justification is the aesthetics of this kind of triumphant exaltation and glory in creation per se, in everything that happens. And there is, that's it. That's the, you know, that's the justification for the world, is the aesthetic beauty of it. But how you perceive that may differ from a person to person, right? Depending on where you start from. So if you enjoy annihilation, maybe atomic bomb is the perfect, you know, expression of beauty, right? Maybe if you're more Apollonian, you would say, no, I want to listen to a concert, and that's my kind of expression of perfect beauty. So there's some, obviously some contentious points that are being made there.
Thank you, Phil. Next up is going to be Maritza. Maritza, go ahead.
So I'm gonna push back a little bit here, Phil. I didn't get the feeling that Nietzsche was saying he was making a vote for one over the other. I was left more with the impression that he was making the case for the need for both. You know, he says, you know, like ultimately what he's saying is, you know, life without emotion without the Dionysian is bleak. So, you know, he's showing, and he tells us that art is the remedy for pessimism. So I don't think he's saying embrace the pessimistic perspective. He's saying life is suffering, but you don't have to be pessimistic about this suffering. That's as I understood what he was saying here. And you know, he has in chapter 16, he has this thing where he goes on and he talks about you know, the particular, like he's talking about how music, you know, it gives the heart of the thing. And I think, you know, so music is a type of art, right? And he says that ideas are universals after the fact. Music are universals before the fact. Reality are universals in the fact. To me, that's a because he does have just this beautiful way of putting things. That's a much lovelier way of saying this thing of how you need all three. Like I hear in the entirety of this work, this entity for balance. Like I hear him saying to us that, you know, great art is going to offer us this way of conceptualizing our lives as meaningful. But we have to consider ourselves artists, and that in a way in which we're, you know, we're creating the meaning by giving the focus to the emotion, by not fearing it, but knowing that at some point there's going to be a temperance of reason. Like I don't see him saying that it has to be all or nothing. Because you know, he says further on in, like, I think chapter 21, he says idea and word save us from the unrestrained outpouring of the unconscious will. And I think that that's his way of showing us that, you know, you go this way, but you have to bring yourself back. So I didn't get the feeling that he was saying one over the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I'm coloring it a little bit because of his later, you know, his later thinking with like the Übermensch and things like that, right?
I'd be interested in chatting with you about some of his later works.
Yeah, because I mean, we know where it ultimately goes, right? It goes beyond good and evil, and you have this sort of idea of Superman that.
But remember that it technically, Superman is the word we use, but Übermensch in German doesn't literally mean super, it means over.
Right, over, right, Superman. Well, super is Latin for above or over. So not in the way we use it, kind of, I guess, more in a vulgar sense, right? But the idea that, you know, and then of course you have this concept of the slave morality and the aristocratic morality. And, you know, his later thoughts, you can kind of see it all, where it's all coming from. And it's beautiful in some ways. It definitely has appeal. Like, look, I'll be the first to say that his heroic kind of attitude towards life, and somewhat tragic, and kind of looking at basically like standing on the brink of, I don't know, like a disaster, some sort of volcanic explosion, and knowing that you're going to be dead in 2 seconds, and yet enjoying it. I mean, there's something appealing about that, right? It's kind of heroic as opposed to complaining and doing all of this. But at the same time, I wonder if it can be everybody's experience, I guess, is what it boils down to, or at all times, right? And he raises the bar pretty high. He says it has to be if we are going to be alive. I mean, otherwise we're not living, we're just kind of subsisting, because our true vocation as a human being is to do this kind of allow ourselves to process this tragedy through us, internalize it, and then produce something beautiful. So, yeah.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Maritza. So I want to address those 2 points about theory and pessimism and optimism. You know, I love Nietzsche. I mean, he's a great artist, and he's a great thinker, because he kind of attacks the crucial issues of his time. But to use his terminology, he's a lion. Okay, he's not a camel. He's not fully a child. He has elements of a child, but he's largely a lion. Okay, and what he's tearing down is really Plato. Okay, I don't want to mix Socrates with Plato. I also don't want to mix Apollo with Plato. Okay, Apollo is something else. Okay, so I want to keep the Apollonian things aside. So how do I do this? So the best terminology I have is, best metaphor I have is from Bacon. Bacon says, look, man is not like an ant who just piles up a bunch of things, collects a bunch of experiences and just piles it up. We are not like spiders or Platos that spin out this entire web from inside their head. Okay, we are like bees. We go searching for honey and we collect honey from every possible source and then organize it in a structure where we can live. Okay, so it is saying a profound yes to reality, what is out there, and then taking all of that in and then organizing it. That's what, human beings are. I think that captures the nature. Now, Plato is a spider. He's basically, his entire republic is saying, okay, these are the ideas, to the hell with the world, to the hell with everything that people have done. This is how things should be. If it is not, it's just bad. So it's like, it is primacy of ideas, primacy of forms over functions. It ignores the functions. If there is something living, he will ignore it because he has a certain idea. And that's a sure way. I don't think Apollo is that. Okay, Apollo, though he's a god of reason, he's using reason in the context. He's also the god of music. So in him, music and reason are all together. The question of, is philosophy higher or is music higher, doesn't happen for Apollo. For him, it is one. Okay, and that's what it is, post all of this kind of, Plato and his effects. What Nietzsche helps us do is to cure our Platonism of various kinds, where we give too much importance to our own ideas and ignore reality. So that optimism that he's criticizing is saying that I have ideas, so I have everything. I'm going to ignore rest of life. And that's the kind of optimism which is based on epistemic arrogance, of having too much confidence in your own ideas and refusing to look at reality. Nietzsche's work is a plea to bring back reality. More than anything else, it is saying, look, life is real. You can experience it. You have eyes, you have a heart. You have a mind. Engage with reality, and don't be slave to the form. Don't be a camel just carrying the forms that Plato is asking you to carry. Be a lion, tear it down, and then hopefully you'll be a child. Now, in terms of pessimism and optimism, it is actually pessimism in the sense, in a sense, it is saying that we do not control everything. There is fate, there is world which we do not control. We have limited control over it. Accepting of that, and you can see it in Seneca, of saying, being ready to die, of being ready, the Stoic principle of just being very ruthless about what is it that you cannot control. Now, what it does is that, and that is, Nietzsche's version of it is amor fati, where you're saying, okay, that is the condition of life, but I can control some things. I can make art. I can do things. And so I should do things. Plato wants to make the world look like what his ideas are, and fails. And he has a false sense of optimism. Nietzsche is trying to go back to reality. And he is too much of a lion that he's doing most of the fighting. And in the process, he's hurting some of the things like poor Socrates, poor Apollo in the process. But really his beef is with Plato, as best as I can see. So that's my take, Phil. I don't know what you think.
No, I agree. I agree with that to a large degree. I think, yeah, I think that's right.
All right. So shall we go to the next section?
Sure. Well, we've kind of covered everything, and now we're just sort of going back and zooming in on specifics. So with that in mind, what I thought about maybe we can do is I want to read a quick passage in my I don't have, unfortunately, it's hard to refer to these things because everybody has a different translation, and so I'll just read it, and hopefully you'll be able to find it. It's really maybe just one sentence, and we can go from there. So the sentence is, I infer the capacity of music to give birth to myth. That's, I mean, when I read it first, it kind of struck me. Music can give birth to myth. And then he keeps going and says, that is to say, the most significant exemplar and precisely tragic myth, the myth which speaks of Dionysian knowledge in symbols. So I want to read that again. The myth which speaks of Dionysian knowledge in symbols. So this right there basically gives us a framework to think about mythology. Mythology, all it is, I mean, this is Jung, pretty much just in one sentence. Mythology is a symbolic expression of Dionysian knowledge. And what is that knowledge? Well, that the world is unstable, that the world is irrational, that the world cannot be comprehended. Our nature, we're part of that world, cannot be comprehended. And mythology is a way for us to remember this truth. Very simple, right? But of course, it can be expressed in a variety of different ways. We talked about Oedipus as being, you know, and this is, again, another point that he makes. I don't know if Shrikant, you caught that, or that in the plays, what people say, what protagonists say, is not as important as what actually happens. Because what happens is has a direct, unmediated connection with this reality that the playwright is expressing. The words he has to think about, he has to think them through and figure it out. So they're not as strong, they're not as unmediated. But the action itself is much stronger, and that's why we remember. Most of the time, we don't remember the exact dialogue, but we do remember what went on. We do remember Antigone, we do remember Oedipus, we do remember, all of these, Agamemnon and so on. I mean, the action itself carries much more force in it because it already has those Dionysian symbols embedded into it. And how is it produced? Well, Nietzsche claims that it's music that's producing it, the universal language, he calls it, the universal ante re, in other words, before things, right? Before facts. So anyway, that's
Wow. Would love to hear what people have to say about that. So I'll make some comments while people are getting ready. I see, this is what I love about Nietzsche. I mean, he really, really understands art, and he understands human psychology at a very deep level. I don't know where to begin here. So one point is about order and chaos. Now, this is a big theme in Jung or Jordan Peterson. Okay, the Platonic world just focuses on order and just tries to put chaos out of the mind. But chaos has both positive and negative. Basically, it is manifest versus unmanifest. So in using the Tao terminology, the Platonists are just playing with things. They're not really looking at the Tao, because Tao has this infinite potential of producing all kinds of things, positive and negative. And you're surrounded by that. You're living in this nature full of potentialities. Whatever ideas that you have, whatever things that you have made are tiny manifestations of what is possible. Metaphysically, that's what Nietzsche is trying to point to. So if you are trying to live by ignoring nature itself, ignoring reality itself, you're missing something. Now, music is actually very deep. because music actually captures the patterns. Because what really matters are deep patterns. Not just deep patterns, but the delicate patterns. Not just delicate patterns, but the interweaving patterns. Life is full of many, many different forces expressing themselves in their own way, interacting with one another at different time frames that go through ups and downs, create crescendos, and then just the depth of things, and then growth again. In the midst of growth, decay, in decay, growth. It's that entire expression which is in nature, which is in human life. I don't think human beings have found a better way of expressing it from within themselves as good as music. I mean, I'm brought up on Indian classical music, which is incredibly deep. And it is considered to be a spiritual discipline. It's like Nada Yoga. It's basically, you're trying to do yoga, you're trying to practice virtue, you're trying to practice the way, using music, using the sound. And it has the full vocabulary to do it, of scales and ways of using scales, ways of improvisation, which has enough structure to it, enough order to it, at the same time, incredible amount of improvisation, facility. I have not seen anybody write like that. Okay, I have not seen any writing like that. They try. I mean, I love Nietzsche. I love literature, but in music, what Beethoven can do, of taking that ba 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 bum, setting up a goal, setting off on that goal, and then going through the second movement of depths of despair, third movement where he's trying to climb out multiple times and failing, and then finally the fourth movement where there is a triumphant progress. And to tell that in all its delicacy, all its complexity, I mean, that's something I've not seen in other works. So I agree with Nietzsche that music has that potential, and you can have a million myths riding on the top of this amazing structure. Phil.
Right. I do want to, this is a minor point. Okay. So I do want to mention, but I do want to mention it anyway. So one example that Nietzsche gives in this dichotomy between trying to understand the world rationally or experience it rationally and experiencing it kind of on a mythical plane, if you will, is this allusion to Faust. We just read Faust, and in part 2, there is this beautiful section where Faust wants to retract Helen from the past and extract her from the past, really. And Mephistopheles, who typically is very confident of his abilities and kind of he knows how to do anything, he kind of shrinks back and says, for that kind of thing, you have to go to the mothers of being. And that expression, even in English, is somewhat unusual, and it evokes something, mothers of being. And in German, it's even better, Mutter or something, I forget. But anyway, the point being is that this expression in itself produces a shudder in Faust, and he shrinks back and he's startled by it. And it symbolizes everything that's kind of back in the past, irrational, dark, really impenetrable. And it's interesting that Goethe, he brings this into his work, where it's not just all rational and magic and alchemy, which is, kind of methodical and scientific in a way, but it's this appeal to things that are completely beyond our understanding. And Helen, of course, is the picture of perfect beauty. And so she has definite connections to art and ideal of art and beauty and so on. And how do you access it? Do you access it through some sort of drawing a circle and putting yourselves in it or something like that, and saying like, abracadabra. No, you can't. I mean, at this point, you have to appeal to something that is way deeper and is primordial like that, the mothers of being. I mean, and Goethe doesn't explain it. He says, I saw it as a mentioned in some obscure place in maybe Plutarch or something like that, and he just copied it. He doesn't know what it is, but he likes the sound of it. And this whole idea is that you can use something without fully understanding it. And that's the contradiction between art in a Dionysian form and art in Apollonian sense, because in Apollonian / Socratic sense, you have to understand what you're talking about. You can't use it unless you explain and understand everything. And so this creates this interesting tension and dichotomy between things that we can enjoy and things that we can understand, and the two do not necessarily overlap.
That was brilliant, Phil. That mothers, the mother of being, all beings. Yes. A simple way of talking about it, that's the Tao. And Tao Te Ching says Tao can't be talked about. If you can name it, it's not the Tao, eternal Tao. It's the same idea. It's the same idea that nature is what it is. Whatever you think of it, it is your thought about it, and you have to have the humility to say, I will continue to listen to nature. Nature is primary. Reality is primary. And I will try to speak of it. I will try to sing to it. But my fecundity is limited. And the fecundity of nature is much, much larger than me. So I have to continuously listen to what it is singing back. So it is a combination of humility. And the Tao captures it beautifully. This entire approach, you're trying to go in accordance with it. That's what a sage does. And when you do, you have that aesthetic experience of Wu Wei, of acting without acting. Everything kind of just flows together in every possible way. Be like water. But you're always saying Tao, yes, like I can't really name it. So it is in a sense, I think in one of the meetups I call it like ambitious humility. Okay, it's saying, look, I have humility in the sense that reality is what it is, and my capacity to grasp it is limited. At the same time, I love it, and I'm doing everything possible. That's what art is, to express reality through not just, and that's again, Plato kind of breaks it up. You're trying to express what you understand of reality through your actions, through your emotions, through your thoughts. It's just one thing, one expression. That's what is artistic, because it's integrated, and it is integrated with the world. Okay, next up is Ella.
Oh, thank you, Shukran. Yeah, I think that we're all from a deeper level of existence, and you can look at it scientifically on a quantum level, or you can look at it in various ways. But it seems that the emotional and physical responses that we all have to music has something to do with the fact that it flows from note to note, from crescendo, to there'll be a quiet moment, as you said, and then the orchestra builds behind the singer, and it's flowing, and it's almost like it's flowing directly from the realm, and the realm of the universe. And that's pretty much it. That's my thought.
Wonderfully put. Thank you. I mean, this is very fundamental, because like Tao is flowing, it's like water. Whereas this Platonic ideas or Parmenidean ideas is that reality does not change. So it is focused on things that don't move, and you're trying to do this unmovable things, and flow itself is something that is foreign to them. They regard it as not kind of natural, something like that. So there is this tension between being and becoming. Whereas if you look at Tao Te Ching, the being kind of comes from becoming. So there is the integration between being and becoming that is there in the Tao and in any kind of integrated kind of philosophy, which is missing from the Platonic view. All right, Phil, you want to go to the next section? You want to comment? Go ahead.
Sure. So let's maybe turn to this idea that the beauty of existence, right? So in part one, I think Nietzsche alludes to it, and he says that, do we really need to justify the beauty of existence? In other words, is life worth something in itself, right? Or do we need to build some kind of abstraction around it to make it sort of worthwhile? And he says existence in itself is beautiful. That's kind of his starting point. And then he says, well, more specifically, when we talk about art and expression, what we're saying is that even if things don't work out for person A in a play, right? Why do we still consider it beautiful? Well, in his mind, it's because there's this concept of eternity of the will. Whatever this person has exemplified, whatever he has expressed in the course of this conflict, in the course of this, a lot of times it's a tragic conflict. Even after the play is over and the person is, quotes, annihilated or dead or something like that, his will as a thing remains. And that will has a certain character and beauty in itself. So this eternity of will. And taking it a step further, he says, people attach meaning and pleasure to phenomena in the world. But really, it's the beauty is behind the phenomena. It's everything that's happening is beautiful with them. They're just the things that are, they're the means of what's happening, but they're not the thing itself. So in order to look at the world properly, you have to look and enjoy this, you have this Dionysian enjoyment of things that are behind the phenomena. The phenomena themselves could be ugly, but what's behind them is not. And that's, I guess, that's the artistic connection where a composer can look at something destructive, like Richard Wagner can look at something that is tragic and make a beautiful thing out of it, or anyone else can look at something tragic and make an expression of something that's beautiful in that, even though the thing itself is tragic and perhaps not beautiful in the phenomena, right? But the thing that's behind the phenomena, that's what's beautiful. So that's, I guess, another point that we can talk about.
Wonderful, folks. If you have any comments, go ahead and type exclamation mark. I mean, I just love this. Like Nietzsche is so good at capturing these points, and he does it so forcefully, and he just zeroes in on really the cruxes of things. Here, what he's basically saying is that this is a profound yes to life itself. As a starting point of you're saying yes to reality, yes to nature, yes to yourself, yes to everything around you, all the people around you, you're saying yes. And in that context, there are all these variations. And then he's seeing those variations only in that context. So he never loses that primary yes, of which there are these multiple phases. All right. If anybody else wants to comment, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. Otherwise, Phil, you can just go to the next one.
Okay.
Folks, feel free to comment on anything. Okay. Go ahead, Phil.
Right. So I guess the other part that we already kind of mentioned is the cathartic nature of Dionysian art, right? So the idea being that is that the thing that, well, I guess it's just a Nietzschean dictum, right? Another one. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger, but I guess you could say it another way. What doesn't kill us makes us more beautiful, because what it does is it forces us to internalize it and then express it. And so understanding that the forces around us are actually always there to help propel us in a particular artistic direction. I mean, that's a great encouragement in some ways, right? Everything around us in some way could be turned into something beautiful, something, you know, and that's our, according to Nietzsche, that's why we're here anyway, right? That's the vocation. Our true vocation is not to try to understand the cause. I mean, that's maybe, you know, he makes us too strong of a point there. I mean, not all of our vocation is to understand everything. Maybe part of our vocation, a big part of our vocation, is to switch that part off and try to just enjoy the show, right? And try to appreciate the beauty of kind of the forces that are so strong and they're all around us. So that's another, I guess that's another point.
Wonderful. If anybody has any comments on this or any other points that have been made, you're welcome to type exclamation mark. Would love to hear your thoughts about everything that Nietzsche is saying. And Phil, I think this format works very well, of just giving an overview and then going through pieces, because each of the pieces is so incredible. Go ahead, continue.
Well, this is another minor point, but I thought it was interesting. So talking about two ways to deal with reality, Nietzsche says that scientists enjoy unveiling nature, but artists enjoy the veiled part. They enjoy seeing something that's veiled, and that gives them inspiration and impetus to create. So that excites them, the fact that there's mystery and this irrationality. And again, it's just another two different ways to approach reality, right? One is saying, I have to understand everything and I have to unveil it. And once you unveil it, you kind of, scientists glory in this unveiling, right? They want to say, hey, by the way, here's the paper that explains how proteins function or whatever, versus an artist would say, I don't know how it functions, and that's why I am so enthralled by it, is because precisely because I don't understand. I don't understand why I enjoy bird singing so much or listening to music so much, and that's what really, it inspires me.
Anybody have any comments on this point about science and art on this? Marisa, can I put you on the spot and say what you think?
Yes, sure. I was trying not to be the only one chatting. So I'm fascinated by the way that he spins it, because again, it's not as negative. It doesn't seem as negative as some of his other works are on a topic go. And I like so he tells us that, he believes that the purpose, and he says it like in black and white, he actually says that, myth is the purpose of science. He says, I quoted this earlier, when reasoning cannot succeed in this endeavor, and by this endeavor, he means, the Apollonian pure reason. He says, myth must also finally serve the necessary consequence. Indeed, even the purpose of science. And I think it's like, I'm just fascinated by his use of the word myth here, and he uses it throughout for other things. And he's talking about how we need, I think he says that it's almost a detriment even to science to not consider this aspect of myth. And he's using myth, and he's using that as a starting point for how he's talking to us about image and idea, and he's getting to art and music. And I see that as his again, his refutal of of science being this overly rational. I hear him saying that the science can be improved by allowing for the interspersing of this non-Apollonian idea. And I think that's, again, that goes to why I see that he's calling for a balance here. Like, he's saying I mean, the actual purpose of science is myth, and you can't get myth without this little thing called art. And so because of that, you need to account for. So I think it's an interesting idea. It's like a very soft call for some type of emotion in science, but I actually think it's the call for intuition, which that makes sense, right? Because intuition would fall on the side of the Dionysian, the experience, the felt, and not just because, and I think that's what he's saying to us in there when he brings it up. What he's saying is the science can only be improved with the infusion of allowed intuition, and subjugating it for the cost of your concept of this pure reason actually is detrimental to, and he goes so far as not just to say to the individual, he says universality. Like, he says, man without myth stands eternally hungry. And that line is like so powerful and imagery to me. And then especially when you go back, and that's several chapters later, that's like in chapter 23. So that's towards the end of the book. But if you remember all the way back in chapter 15, he talks about, that's where he first tells you that myth is necessary and the purpose of science. And to me, when you remember it in that light, it just shines a spotlight. It makes it all so obvious to me that what he's saying is that we have to remember that there's a huge role that intuition must play in science.
Okay, thank you, Maritza. This is what I think is going on. So firstly, I think, regarding science and art, Nietzsche understands art. Okay, he doesn't understand science because, and there is a reason for that. Basically, he thinks he doesn't understand Apollo, he doesn't understand Socrates, he doesn't understand science. For all of it, he's really placing Plato, the Platonic way of doing science, Platonic way of doing reason. That's what he's attacking, really. He doesn't really understand what is science without it. Okay, actual science has nothing to do with Plato. Okay, so like, for example, let me read out a quote, okay, from somebody. He says, he talks about, he describes scientists as, can you read out the description of scientist, Phil, one time, of what he says? And I want to contrast it to this description.
The description of scientists?
Science that you read out from Nietzsche.
Well, I do have another passage that actually kind of spells it out pretty clearly. So let me just
Sure, go ahead.
So it says, for the periphery of the circle of science has an infinite number of points. And while there's still no telling how the circle can ever be completely measured, yet the noble and gifted man, even before the middle of his career, inevitably comes into contact with these extreme points of the periphery, where he stares at the inexplicable. When he here sees to his dismay how logic coils round itself at these limits and finally bites its own tail, then the new form of perception discloses itself, namely tragic perception, which in order even to be endured requires art as a safeguard and remedy. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so what I want to say is that science in its true nature is actually, actually takes on much of what is being said. So science is all about saying, let me just read out, let somebody else speak. It says, I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself, I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore and diverting myself in now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. Isaac Newton. So you see, that respect for the unknown
You read Einstein, you read Darwin in original, you read Faraday in original, you see the same respect for the unknown by all these scientists. And they really want to know. They know that they don't know, like Newton is saying. And they're all, trying to, I think Will wants to say something. Will, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. I just wanted to ask what that quote from Newton was again. I'm sorry, I missed it, about the seashell.
Yes, that's the one. That's the one by Newton. So if you search in Google for Newton and seashore, you'll find the quote. It's one of his favorite quotes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So what happens is that what Nietzsche is actually attacking is Plato, and he deserves to be attacked exactly the way in which Nietzsche is attacking him. But there is a lot more. Like if you look at the tradition, so for example, here we're talking about order and chaos, right? What is known and what is unknown. You see, the science is all about this wonder for the unknown, that curiosity, unlimited curiosity. A great scientist, once he has found something, he doesn't go on saying, oh, I found this. He does exactly what Newton does. And this is at the end of his life, okay? Newton's laws and stuff, everybody else said, oh, now we have Newton's laws, we are all done. Newton is saying, I just found a prettier pebble. What are you talking about? There is this entire ocean. That is the same approach a great artist has. So at a very deep level, a great scientist and great artist are very similar to each other. Now, the mode of expressions are different. What great artists do is that they take something which is really at the edge of consciousness, which is just at the edge of the consciousness, and give it some kind of a form so people can say, oh, yeah, that is what I feel when I have this kind of inkling, there is something there. And, oh, thank you so much, the sculptor or the composer or the writer, that you have made this more apparent to me. The bar for scientists is higher than that, because you want to be able to explicate it. You want to be able to capture the pattern that you're seeing. But all scientists are aware, great scientists. Now, of course, there are lower scientists who are doing is the Platonic game of saying ideas are here, and I'm just going to deduce from here. That is the Platonic way, where there is primacy of ideas. So it's really a issue of primacy of ideas versus primacy of reality. So that's how I see it. When you look at it that way, to me, like science and art is the same. Great science and great art is very similar to each other. Go ahead. Let's see. Ella, you had something. Ella, go ahead.
Sure. Along those lines, I just had a quote from Carl Jung, on the function of an artist. And he said, as a human being, the artist's moods, will, and personal aims exist. But in a higher sense, he or she is a collective person, one who carries the shapes of the unconscious. And I would say the shapes of us all in Carl Jung's collective unconscious sense, because these archetypes are from the collective unconscious, that is, the ancient unconscious of all of humanity and probably the universe. So, but yeah, I think he sees the artist in this quote as being a collective, an individual, yes, but also as one who can tap into, as you were saying, Shrikant, the unconscious. And that's why we know when it touches us, it's part of our collective unconscious. We know what the meaning of this, and taps that deeper sense of each of us as individuals, because it's collective material. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. That's a great point. That's an additional thing here, because what scientists are doing is that they're trying to most scientists, they're physical scientists, they're trying to study things out there. An artist is not only talking about what is out there, but what is in here. And they commune with the entire of civilization, all people, in order to try to find the patterns that are happening, not just in nature, but in human beings and between human beings. And that's what they're trying to express in their work. Thank you, Ella. Phil.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to have to disagree with you a little bit, Shrikant, because I think that while Nietzsche, I agree with you, he probably was not a good scientist or didn't know much about science. But I think what he really does understand is the relationship between society and this idea that science can answer the deepest needs of human nature. And this pessimism and optimism that he's talking about is right there at the intersection of that. So Newton in 17th century probably did not ever consider that science would answer the deepest needs of human heart. It would probably never cross his mind to even suggest that. He was a devout Christian and so on. So there were things that were off limits to science. However, the world that we are in today and the world that Nietzsche was already experiencing, and I think somebody mentioned at the very outset of our meetup that Nietzsche famously authored the phrase "God is dead." So what does that mean? Well, that means somebody has to take the place of God, right? Somebody has to take that place, and what has taken its place? Well, we know what it has taken. It's irrationality in science. That's how we live. If we have a question today, we don't go to our sacred texts. We go to psychologists or mathematicians or whatever. In other words, we have this optimism that we can solve all of our problems, potentially at least, through this rational apparatus that we have. And that may be true, I mean, for all we know. But Nietzsche says that if that's the case, then this civilization that has this optimistic cheerfulness will not produce great works of art, will not produce great tragedies, at least in his mind, and will not produce great music. It will not produce anything like that. And by the way, this echoes with Oswald Spengler's view. His book on Decline of the West pretty much echoes exactly the same sentiment, where he says that cultures in decline tend to focus on science and technology. This is so much opposite of what we think, right? We think that advanced civilizations are civilizations that put primacy on science and technology. But he says, no, civilizations that are rising up and on their trajectory upwards, they place primacy on art and creativity versus what he calls the spiritual element, right, of their culture. They're very high on that, and the spiritual is what drives the arts and the rest of it. But once a culture reaches a certain point and it starts turning on itself and it starts to protect and preserve, then it does it turns from that to science and technology. And of course, in Nietzsche's viewpoint, you can trace that same thing happening with the Greeks, right? It starts out with this enormous energy, with Homer, with Aeschylus, Sophocles, and then it kind of starts winding down by the time Euripides starts it out, and then it's gone, basically. All of that energy is gone, and then we have really, by the time we get to Hellenism, we still have plays, we still have a lot of works, but they're nowhere near the level and the kind of the force of the original. So he definitely has some kind of there's some truth to what he's saying, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And perhaps the question is not necessarily about science, but it's more about the role of science in society. How is it seen, and how is it overstepping its boundaries to a degree? because then what we have is we have excluded Dionysus from our lives, right? We have made, we have sort of isolated us in these safe spaces where Dionysus has no has no access to us, and therefore we're sterile. We don't have that vibrancy and that impetus, that energy that drives creativity.
Bill, I really like talking to you because I actually completely agree with what you're saying right now. And I want to explain what I said before and what you said. And I want to say something that brings all of this together. It's the issue of form and function. There is a function of science, and there is a form that science creates. Now, Plato is all about forms. It's about grabbing whatever forms they can, Platonic way of approaching, and then just going deductively. I said, who needs the function? The function is the Tao. The function is human. One of the great books that I have read recently is by C.S. Lewis called Abolition of Man, which is actually could be also called Abolition of God or Abolition of the Tao, where his core idea there, he uses the concept Tao there. He's saying, look, Tao is what it is. If you replace it by what you think, that's the product of science. See, doing science is exactly what Newton was talking about. That is full of awe for the Tao. And you are continuously generating ideas. It is creative. It is very much creative as art in generating ideas. But moment different people take over, the Platonic people take over, or people who say forms are here, okay, goods are here. Who needs people who can produce it? Who needs creativity? Who needs human beings? Okay, human creativity. That is when things start to die. So it is really the distinction between focus on function of science and form of science. When you put forms before function, like Plato does, and Plato is the dominant philosopher of the West. So in one form or the other, he shows up everywhere. Okay, so what is happening here? What Spengler is describing, what Nietzsche is describing, is basically the Platonists who actually have taken over the forms which somebody else has created. They don't have capacity of actually creating forms based on function. And then they deductively try to do what is called, what Taleb calls the Procrustean bed, where they design the bed and they cut up the person if they are too tall, and they stretch the person to death if they are too small to fit them in that bed. That is what forms are like. It kills the functions by trying to fit them into forms. And that is the cause of the decline of societies, because they have lost the living principle. So it is about function and form. And the brilliance of Nietzsche is that he hones in that something is going wrong, something huge is going wrong, because he sees people doing this kind of Procrustean bed of ideas to destroy human creativity. And that's what he's rebelling against. So I have, but that's how it integrates what I said and what you said. Does this make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so, to a degree, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's go to Ella. Ella, you're next.
Yes. On the forms leading the way, Shrikant, as you said, idealism, Plato, and others following Plato philosophically, killing the function. Agree. You know, they develop an elaborate system to support the forms, and the function is ignored, which is human and the nature of the universe. But then as a human, if you just go with Nietzsche, you're left with no system, no support. It's sort of, well, what now? You know, there's an antithesis, but there's no resolve. Thank you.
Great observation, Ella. I mean, that's why I say Nietzsche is a lion. You know, he's taking down camels. That's what he's doing. He's not yet a child. Okay, he's kind of partly, he has some elements of the child, but not quite there. But if you want to look at it, I mean, give you examples of, for example, let's say we've been studying religion, right? There are religion follows the same path as this. There is a core idea which is tremendously life-giving. And then there is a whole bunch of people who come in a kind of a political way to kind of use those forms that have been created in order to kind of get people to do some things. There are times where these things lives. You know, you can see times where things are very healthy. So what you have to go back. So it's like, it's not as if that there is just form and then there is, you know, people start using functions. Sorry, there's never that there is just function, because function always needs forms for its expression. It's like one thing. Now, what happens is that when forms become primary, forms are needed. So there are times, if you go further back, you can look at time, you can find times like, especially in the axial age, you know, we're looking at the work of, you know, Bhagavad Gita, Tao Te Ching, and Gospel of John. There is a living quality to the forms that are there. And then that is lost. So it's not I mean, because he's a lion, he's kind of tearing down forms, but that doesn't mean that it is form versus function. It's not spirit versus matter. There is a way of having an integration. And so all of these kind of holistic religions, for example, or in the person of people like Newton, like Beethoven, like Leonardo da Vinci, you see both forms. You see function and form together at an individual level, and you can also see it at a social level. So it's definitely possible. But you know, I don't criticize Nietzsche too much about this, because you kind of have to tear down things. If things are wrong, and that's all you can see. You have to first tear it down. You have to say no. You know, he calls, there is a sacred yes, but there is a sacred no. So what he does is that he does the sacred no, and then you kind of have to say, okay, then this is what you have to give up, and now let's build again, something like that. So you have to be a child, but lion is a necessary path. You know, like Jung says, you know, in the filth it would be found. So you have to go through that in order to do that. Phil, would you like to comment?
On which part?
On anything, or you can go to the next section.
Well, I thought that another interesting comparison or statement was about how music is, in fact, just a different expression of the world. And we talked about music being the universal language, but I thought that was another beautiful way of expressing it. And of course, you know, we talked about music engendering myth, and music being also a universal that is before things. So it's essentially, it is kind of like a Platonic form, right? It is a Platonic ideal, music is, but it kind of has existence of its own, because it's mathematical in some ways, and because it's because also it's kind of irrational and deep, and before really anything can be expressed, right? It just is. But the other point that Nietzsche makes about it is that he says music is not completely abstract either, and he compares it to geometrical figures and numbers, right? Because music is based on numbers, and he says that it's not completely abstract. It actually, there's some kind of like, I think Shrikant, you mentioned patterns. There's something about it that encodes reality in some way. And when we discover that pattern and when we express it, that's why it has such force, and that's why we get such enjoyment from it. And that's why it has this capacity to take the next step and kind of facilitate the birth of myth and the birth of tragedy that comes afterwards, right? So you have music, myth, and tragedy. They're all kind of following each other. And of course, tragedy starts with music, right? The tragodia is the song, the goat song, right? It started with this procession of Dionysus, right? Where they were singing and playing avlos, which is a reed pipe. So all of that is interconnected, right? This whole thing is kind of, it's coming together to this musical origin, and we're back to music as a universal that underpins it all in a way. So
wonderful. Phil, I know it's getting close to 11 o'clock,
Yep.
so I want to wrap up. So firstly, I want to say I'm just delighted, I'm very grateful to you for bringing this level of literature and literary criticism, appreciation of literature to us, in various forms, not only the particular things that you've done in terms of, this Birth of Tragedy or Faust or Dante, but people like Barfield. It's been amazing. Can you briefly tell about what are you going to do next month? And
right.
then,
So yeah, we're gonna do reading from Ferdinand de Saussure, who is the father of structuralism. And structuralism is a super interesting movement or school of thought in linguistics, but it really has a much larger connotations and implications in philosophy. It has links to anthropology and philosophy in general in postmodernism eventually. So we want to touch on some of the kind of main points that Saussure made more than 100 years ago in talking about language and language structure. And Shrikant, you have been very interested in language, so I thought it might be a good topic for us to talk about. Specifically, I mean, just this is as a kind of a teaser, okay? So how do we know the meaning of anything, of any word, like a horse or a car or a window? Well, if you go to a dictionary, what you will find is, because the dictionary is finite, eventually the words are described or defined in terms of each other. So they're circular in meaning. So in fact, we can't really know what anything means because we just end up in the circle, right? So how do we actually know what anything means? Well, the way we know what anything means is because of the context and the connections of a particular word with other words, with other meanings. And this was a key thing that Saussure and the people after him started building on. A key observation that really builds up the structuralism, the theory of structuralism, is that really what defines anything is not the thing in itself necessarily, but how it's connected with other things. So a network, right? A graph, if you will. If you're from a computer science background, it's a graph theory. I think how things are connected together. And a language, any language forms such a graph or a network. And it can be analyzed and it can be described as such. And then we have an interesting discussion that Saussure will attack heads on, which is, do particular words have any intrinsic meaning? If everything is defined in terms of this connection, are words pretty much arbitrary? A word like a tree, is it arbitrary? I mean, putting aside words that are what do you call them? Homonyms, or words that sound like what they describe. Putting those aside, like buzzing and sneezing and so on. Putting everything, most words do not sound anything. Their sound has nothing to do with what they're describing. So are they arbitrary? Or are they intrinsic? Is there intrinsic meaning in the words themselves? So Saussure kind of will talk about that. So that's my teaser for next time.
wonderful. Thank you, Phil. So Phil, I've always promised Phil that he can leave by 11 o'clock whenever he needs to. So you're welcome to leave, but I want to give an opportunity for people to talk. Any thoughts on, this is your last chance to, I would love to hear what you thought of the discussion of Birth of Tragedy, what you got from Nietzsche. What do you think about Nietzsche? You're welcome to comment. So next up is going to be Maritza, but would love to hear from anybody else. Maritza, go ahead.
I really loved hearing both of your insights, Phil and Shrikant. I want, you brought up the last point you made, Phil, was on how Nietzsche also describes music as a kind of as a language of the world. I find it interesting that he calls it the language of the unmuted world. I just thought that was like just so descriptive, and he's saying it's not just like the world in general. He's painting this image of it's the unmuted. So in other words, what comes to mind to me is like vivid, vibrant, like present. That paints like a great imagery for how he goes on then to continue speaking of music. And he also talks about it as being the he brings up in like towards the end of the book, he talks about how, like, he asks about where's the unity, or where does the mystery of the unity between like German music and German philosophy, where does that point? And he says, well, if not, obviously it's like it's a new form of existence about whose meaning we can inform ourselves only through speculating. And he's talking about it from the idea of it's this, like, he goes, at least as to my understanding, he goes on even to maybe imply that we can use music towards helping us understand some other aspects of this world in general. And I just think that that's kind of an interesting way for him to put on it, because he's talking about he says that music, he says Dionysian music confronts us as such a universal mirror. And he's talking about, like, he brings up again, he says it's the world of will, and he speaks about it being a reflected mirror that widens at once for our feelings into the image of an eternal truth. And I feel like it's like he puts such a heavy definition on this little word music. But then he goes on to show us how it can hold it, and it stems from what you were describing, Shrikant, about the forms, is that he puts in he puts that in, and it allows us, it gives us the brackets for all these little, like, it seems like he's putting such heavy weight on music, and you're like, there's no way that this concept that he's doling out to us can stand up to this. But I feel like that one piece where he takes the time to talk about the forms, and he says that it's the music is the universal before the fact. I think that one statement kind of shows that where the foundation is that he's coming from for everything else he says about music, and as if one can extrapolate towards art. So I just thought it was great, and I really enjoyed hearing your perspectives. Thank you.
Can I give
Please.
another quote, and then I will leave
Please.
because I have to go. So this goes to maybe summarizes what Maritza was talking about, and what I was talking about with this place that music holds, which is this observation that Nietzsche makes, and here's the quote: "Suitable music played at any scene reveals its deepest meaning." So if you play something in a place in an opera or ballet or something, note how it reveals the deepest meaning of that particular scene. I mean, I can think of like these great composers, Tchaikovsky and Wagner, and I mean so many others. You can think of the scene and you can think of the music, right? It's kind of forms that unity that you were talking about, and that unity is where music really comes into its own and underpins it, just like action underpins the words, right? Nietzsche points out that action is actually more profound than the words that are spoken. So music in that same way is more profound than even perhaps the action, right? It's just the scene itself and the music. So that's my last contribution. I will.
And on that high note, good night, everybody.